So we're going to examine the basis of our belief system in Mormonism. Going to have to go back a little ways on this. Yesterday I did a little video which the title was something like The Destruction of Mormon Apologetics in the Book of Mormon Challenge. And then added on a part having to do with a book a fellow wrote in an interview, which was very revealing regarding content for the Book of Mormon. In here, I want to talk about how we believe what we believe to get started. In other words, what is the basis of Mormonism? We've talked a lot about LDS history, Mormon history, and compared original source documentation to the correlated lesson materials that we receive. However, I'm going to use a little bit of history and stories and go a little farther back so that we can really get a basis for Mormonism. People have, we have such strong beliefs, but what is it we really base them on? So let me start with a story. I'll try not to get too upset here, because it involves someone that I hold very dear in my heart. But when I met this certain someone, I knew I was looking for a particular person that I had preconceived ideas about so far as LDS doctrine or the doctrines taught in some cases by Emanuel Swedenborg that Joseph Smith adopted, having to do with premortal existence and kindred spirits. Or as Brigham Young put it, what did he say? Did he say kindred spirits? When he told Henry Jacobs, that he needed to get a new wife because he was taking his wife. He was taking over for Joseph Smith, who had taken Henry's wife. And he said, go out and get you a new wife. I'm taking her over, basically. He said, it's time for men who are walking in other men's shoes to get out of them. Your wife belongs to Joseph Smith, and I'm his proxy, so I'm taking your family. And that's one of the parts of LDS history that I find particularly repugnant. So he said basically, words to the effect that, but this time make sure that she's not someone else's, soulmate or kindred spirit. And as we look at Brigham Young and the doctrines, some of the doctrines that he taught, they're deemed heretical by Spencer Kimball and more recent presidents of the LDS Church, but the origins of some of these doctrines are rather interesting. And we don't pay attention to those because LDS Apologia ignores it. They'd rather lead us to arguments that they have framed in a way to limit the damage that they can do to people's belief that the LDS Church is guided by an all-knowing, unchanging God who speaks to holy prophets. All right, well, I took a little break there, kind of a long break, so I pick up about where I left off there. Why do we believe what we believe? Does it really make sense? Like I mentioned before, people in conversations like on the internet and so forth say, how is it that Mormons believe what they believe? After examining certain historical issues and so forth, people find it difficult to believe that Latter-day Saints believe what they believe, if they even know what they believe, since it's changed so much. A lot of the younger generations say I see comments like, we don't believe that, what are you talking about? Well, they used to. So I was in this conversation with someone very special to me, and I said something really weird to say the first time you meet somebody. I hadn't been thinking about it, maybe it just came out of my mouth, but I had, I was where I was for the purpose of locating my soulmate. And of all the weird things to come out of my mouth, I said, do you know that there's a prophet in the land? This was at a Mormon dance, so The answer I got was No, but I do believe very much in God and Jesus. And anyway, I'm not going to relate the whole experience there. It's probably a little too much emotionally, but I later learned that the experience of this person learning about God and Jesus, as they were called, came through Catholicism. And this person's experience with Catholicism in the family growing up was not altogether positive, and actually had some extremely negative things associated with it. Nevertheless, for the purpose of this conversation, I have looked back at that and thought, how is it that a belief in God and Jesus, these Catholic God and Jesus, could be retained by someone who really didn't feel good about the religion for very good reasons? And thus, I see an introduction into the subject of how it is we believe things, whether or not they make a great deal of sense, and how that process is accomplished. And a few years later, I received a phone call from a child of mine saying, "Hey, Dad, check out this YouTube. Check out this video. There's something in here I want you to see." And it had to do, the goal there was, to see some, a little bit of some clarification on, some things about how the world is run and financially and so forth. Federal Reserve banking system, things like that, creation of money and various things. The movie was called The Zeitgeist. But at the beginning of that Zeitgeist movie, so I started at the beginning. And so and maybe we're kind of talking back and forth on the phone while I'm looking at this. And after watching the beginning, my reaction was, do you realize, did you view that first part? Oh yeah, I'm not worried about that. I was worried about the, Federal Reserve System part or whatever. I'm like, do you not realize that first part just destroyed your basis for religious beliefs in Mormonism? And somehow that had just, I don't know, but I'm not worried about that, Dad. And the subject matter of that is something that I wanted to get into here, because basically it goes back, and I want to go back before the time of Joseph Smith. I want to go back about as far as, we have some kind of reasonable amount of information, because it enters into how we get to the beliefs that we now have in Mormonism. And I'll probably do something more in depth with this. I'm not an expert on ancient religion really, but I'm not entirely unread on it. And so what we do know is that within the context of Christianity in the broader sense, which I'm including Mormonism in, much to the chagrin of any Christian listeners, and because it is the basis for the beginnings of Mormonism. Within that belief system, we've got the creation story, and then we've got a 6,000-year period since the time when we are told Adam and Eve became mortal, and that the earth fell with Adam, basically, and death entered the world. Actually, pretty sure, it'd be good if I had a Bible reference on that, but the Book of Mormon clearly states that death entered the world at the time of the fall of Adam and Eve, partaking of the forbidden fruit. So if that happens, that Joseph Smith was preaching a Christian religion at that point in time when he published the Book of Mormon. And Christian beliefs and concepts are what we find in the Book of Mormon. And so basically, if you go back beyond 6,000 years with anything, any life on Earth, according to the Book of Mormon, that's a big problem. Especially the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible also, which states that Adam was the first flesh upon the earth, the first man also. That doesn't work too well with like the apologetics that the Catholics are now using to try to get around the pre-Adamite population. But civilizations existing prior to 6,000 years ago would tend to be a problem. And according to people that study archaeology and anthropology, there are discoveries that talk about those things. Talk about religious organizations, religion 9,000 years ago around the Indus Valley, and spawning religion. Of course, before that, we've got, it appears, according to the evidence that they present, there are places that are, maybe 12,000 years old. And then there are mines, gold mines, things like that, maybe diamond mines. Many, many, many thousands of them in South Africa that are supposedly, said to be very, very old, like more than 100,000 years old. And you get into the talk about, some of the things that supposedly may have evolved into the Sumerian nation and civilization. But Sumer, is something that we show on the map there as far as a civilization, which basically, led into Babylon after that and Egypt after that, as far as large, well-recognized civilizations with religious beliefs and so forth. And it looks like before that there are things in the Indus Valley. And so when we look at Christianity, we have to look at Judaism. And when we look at Judaism and the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, is that something we just took for granted? Oh, there was this guy called God and he made the world in 6 days. He said, let there be light, and, all this stuff. And it's, we don't have a lot of information before that for some reason. Things like, burning the library of Alexandria, Egypt by the Roman legions. Or, in fact, I think Alexandria was wasted like 3 times. So in other words, when we destroy evidence of prior history, it makes it easier to promote a new version. And perhaps the Roman Empire did a good job of that. Made it easier to promote Christianity. Because before Christianity, we have Judaism. And before Judaism, what do we have? If we think that the Bible is history, you can say, well, we've got the Garden of Eden and all that sort of a thing. But these Israelites didn't appear till, there really isn't any, outside source other than what they say in these Old Testament books before 1200 BC or so of the Israelite tribes existing. And they appear to be some maybe they were Canaanite tribes. They lived in the land of Canaan, is what it appears to be. So we've got this so-called history in the Bible, but it really doesn't look like it was written in the time that it says it was with Moses. If you examine it, most scholars who have examined it are thinking closer to between 7th, 8th century BC, that they're writing as if they are Moses, several hundred years prior. And the anachronisms in there tend to show that. So I'm not getting too strongly into that. I wanted to say that so if you've got this belief, okay, here's God and he's, this is the way it was. Well, if we look in history, that's not what we see. What we see is these, or maybe these Canaanite tribes who have these beliefs, and they're not quite what we see today, necessarily. And Judaism, as we know it, it wasn't a monotheistic thing always. Monotheism developed. The Canaanites had multiple gods. And the Canaanites were preceded by, like I said, things like out of the Indus Valley and various other, spots in all, greater Mesopotamia and live in whatever that, all that Middle Eastern area. So we've got gods and goddesses. We've got a worship that it is similar to many types of primitive ancient religions that are based around the sun and generation of life. And we see that going through the mystery religions. You know, we see that in ancient things, and then we'll see it up in the time near the Romans, you know, was it Mithra? And we see very similar names for the same deities. And sometimes we see different, depending on the language, for these same deities that seem to continue, and they were based on the sources of life. And so many words in our language now that we attribute certain meanings to didn't necessarily have that same type of meaning. As we look, I'm not really great, my vocabulary is not super, what is it, the etymology of certain words. If we look back, we find some very interesting meanings. Words like sacred and holy. You know, if we look at various languages, the Greek and the Latin and some of these origins of these languages and these words, and, you know, and then going into your more, you know, Indo-European languages and so forth, we keep finding the sun and the sun god, or you know, this things related to the sun, S-U-N. You know, we find those things, and it's so interesting to look at different languages, because when you look at the roots of these words, you find out so much. And we find things tied to the sun and to fertility rites. What we have in Christianity, where we talk about the, you know, Jesus being God incarnate, if we look back further, we may find in anthropomorphic God incarnate, where basically God, whoever this God was, the male God, taking on a physical body in the form of the first man, breathing into him the breath of life, and it being God. In other words, Adam is God in some of these religious beliefs, and Brigham Young taught this. So we thought, oh, where did he get this wacky stuff? Adam is God, you know? But if you look back into ancient religions, you will very likely find that God incarnate wasn't about Jesus Christ, somebody being born of a virgin, of an existing species, but the first man being formed out of the earth, or out of a rock, you know, these various forms of God. So they sooner or later they all get back to things like the sun and generation. When I say generation, I'm talking about, you know, reproduction. So in Egypt, you know, by the time you get to Egypt, you've got the obelisk, which is, you know, phallic symbol. It's reproductive, and when you are aware of that and you see it, you know, at the Vatican inside of a circle, which, you know, the representation of the female, and you see this in, you know, copied in other places, a similar motif, maybe in Washington D.C. or in London or Paris, or this particular occult religion becomes very important within our society, although it is hidden, but it's hidden in plain sight. The Latin, you know, forms of language for hidden, you know, we find the word occult, occulto, that sort of a thing. We find it just means hidden. And so we've got this pantheon that turns into a monotheistic religion with maybe one of the sons of El becoming the dominant god, being the, whom we call Yahweh. And maybe his brother was Baal. They were both maybe sons of El. In Hebrew, we see these words, these names, referring to El as God. Daniel, Ezekiel. El is God, Israel. El was God, not Yahweh. But Yahweh appears to be, a son, and a competing son with Baal possibly. And these tribes were competing with each other for survival apparently. And whoever their protector god was, we find, they had a dominant, either they had a set of gods or they had a dominant god, whether it was, Yahweh or Dagon or where's my mind? And who was the Moabites' god, right? Who was he? Silly that I'm having trouble remembering. But so when was it? Various other countries, nations conquered the Israelites. They said they brought back the gods from the temples of the Israelites, pluralistic gods, not monotheistic, like even 800 BC or so. With the Moabites and what's his name? Chemosh. So basically they were saying, our God was more powerful than your God. We kicked your butts because Chemosh, beat your gods. And they were gods plural there. And then we look back even in the Bible, and was it 1 Kings chapter 12? I think you're reading about, the king, was it Joachim or whatever. Actually I think I got his keyed up somewhere. And he makes calves for these people to worship. And if we look back at, this is the king, and this isn't something necessary. So where do they get this stuff from? From their pantheon or from Egypt or where? Because we see all this anti-other gods business going on, but we don't see where it comes from, you got the story of the golden calf and, in the Exodus. But if we look carefully in the Old Testament, we'll find other references to actually the Israelites worshiping other forms or representations of their God. And in some cases it is a calf. These things represent various things that came maybe with an agrarian society. The sun worship had a lot to do with that. So I better probably pick up the pace here on this, huh? So here's an article, How the Jews Invented God and Made Him Great. It says, the God of the Old Testament started out as just one of many deities of the ancient Israelites. It took a traumatic crisis to make him into the all-powerful creator of the world. Here's something on, was the Passover originally an ancient Canaanite ritual to stop the rains? Baal was the storm god, right? And where does the Eucharist or the sacrament come from? In other words, if you're not familiar with Catholicism, we're talking about you're eating the literal flesh and blood. You're cannibalizing Jesus within Catholicism when you partake of the Eucharist. It's the doctrine of transubstantiation. Supposedly the priest actually has the power to turn, the wafers into the body, the actual flesh of Jesus, not just symbolic, but actual. Same thing with the wine. So if you look at where we get some of these strange ideas, they are rooted in religion that is much older than Christianity. And some of it's older, than Judaism. And if we look at the Zoroastrian roots of some of Judaism and Kabbalism, the Kabbalistic Judaism, you're finding things, related to planetary things, astrotheology. And you can find it if you understand what you're looking for in the Old Testament. It's over a period of time, I've come to be aware of some things, and it's not this cut and dried Adam and Eve thing that they made up, maybe 700 BC or something, and put in this Bible and said it was Moses writing it, hundreds of years after he would have existed. There's at least probably 3 writers of the priesthood, creating this Genesis account. If not the other books of Moses, obviously had nothing to do with anybody named Moses. as far as being an author. It was long after the time where this guy would have lived, and long after the time of, supposed creation and all these things. It's like, if there was this God, why didn't we have a record from the time of Adam, But what we have is we've got religion organized well before 6,000 years ago. And we've got these religions that have evolved, and certain ones have dominated, and Judaism dominated. And what we find, these gods, they are transformed from one civilization to another in some cases. So we find the remnants of, in the beginnings of the creation story. We find the beginnings of, this global flood, this deluge story, in prior civilizations. Some people think there was a deluge maybe 10,000 years ago, possibly of near global or near global proportions. Who knows? But at least to the world where they were. And we find these rituals that we think are sacred that came from the God of Israel, who is, you've got this story that we've got, but we don't have the soup that it came out of presented to us in correlated lesson materials in Sunday school, because it doesn't work. That's why we get rid of history, so we can rewrite it. When you go to the temple and you receive washings and anointings, where did that come from? And if you look deeper, you'll find maybe things practiced in underground caves, with washings and anointings, similar things. Maybe with, Mithra and similar, forms of the name. You see the evolution into the Roman gods, from maybe Indus Valley gods and things, related to other Eastern religions, and blended with Semitic people. And then we see Roman gods evolving, or maybe transforming. Have you ever looked at Apollo? You ever seen pictures that you thought were Jesus with a halo and found out it was actually Apollo? I have. Have you seen, like, temples that are built, maybe like the temple of Jupiter or the temple of Apollo? And what are they built upon? Sometimes they're built right on top of a previous one from a previous version of the same god or goddess. And when we look at we've got the Heavenly Mother or the Divine Mother concept. The Catholics talk about a little bit about that. If we look into ancient religion and we look at Isis, not talking about the terrorist group, we look at Isis or Diana or Semiramis, if I pronounce that correctly, Columbia, the Statue of Liberty. Who is this goddess? Well, these ancient religions have survived. They survived as the mystery religions, and they survived partially incorporated into the religions marketed to the people by the priestly class. We think in America we're programmed to believe we have separation of church and state. In reality, things are much different than the way we view them. And if we look back at the history of the occult, of the mystery religions, of ancient societies, we find the deification of leaders. Like, Pharaoh would basically be a god. And Brigham Young was pretty much living the same way. And that's not a unique thing. We have the deification of the leaders, but the the priestly class, the priests were the next, they were like a next step down. They were a step or two down from the heads of society. They're an important part, and they administer religion through mysticism, through magic, through spiritual teachings. And when we look back farther, all these things are one. When we look into Freemasonry more deeply and study the teachings of the higher degrees and the cultists that teach those kinds of things, like Manly Palmer Hall and Albert Pike and Eliphas Levi, what we see is a merging merging of all these things. Or what we see is that they were all one and are now presented as separate. And some of it has been presented, they separated science, from the magic and alchemy. And they separated church from, and created basically a possibility for operating a Hegelian dialectic opportunity for, working two sides against the center with, say, evolution and creationism. But as we look back, these scientists, these great minds, were all involved in the occult and secretive and secret organizations. And they were practitioners of the occult. They were sorcerers, people like Newton, for instance. They were Freemasons, sorcerers, Rosicrucians, were this Egyptian mystery religion, which was the Babylonian mystery religion, which was, Sumerian and things blended from others, has survived. And these are our leaders in society. These are our leaders in religion who market to us, the common people, a different religion. In Mormonism and Christianity. But what we find is that the leaders of these religions are practitioners of the occult in actuality, and only feign their belief in the things that they teach. So I wanted to look at the origins of this fellow named Jesus Christ that the Romans marketed to us. And I got something queued up here. So part of what I'm saying is that religions have been used by the ruling class as a social management tool for millennia. And getting people to believe in what you want them to believe allows you to more easily control them. And what we see is deities of various conquering civilizations being placed upon the conquered. An excellent example would be Roman Catholicism in Latin America. The Native Americans were cooked alive or tortured in various ways. We see missions set up all over, various areas, especially along the Pacific. But these were not necessarily pleasant experiences for the American Indians. And what we find in Latin American culture, the word Latin, we're thinking Latin, the Latin language, the Latin culture, the Roman Empire culture put upon these people. And so you have, when you look up, demographic statistics for religion, for instance, in various areas of the Western Hemisphere, especially, if you look in countries like Mexico or everything south from Mexico, you're going to see a very high numeric value for Roman Catholicism as far as religious affiliation. And the Native Americans that were living in the Americas were not worshiping Jesus Christ when the Spaniards came. And their missionaries were using some pretty overt tactics for conversion, the kind of thing that you find in the Inquisition. Either you believe or you burn. So many faithful believers in Jesus Christ of what we might call Hispanic roots at this point, related to people who either came from Europe or people who mixed from Europe, or even didn't necessarily mix a whole lot with the American Indians, shared their religion in a way that doesn't really represent what we'd call religious choice and freedom. So let's take a look at where Jesus Christ came from. How this, let's see, either this is true or it's not, but let's take a look at some information here. It's very similar to the way Joseph Smith came out with the Book of Mormon, using literary abilities from various people and various sources, gathering of information to create a narrative that actually has a veiled message that those who are in the know will see differently than those who are the common people. So, let me read a little bit here. His presentation will be part of a one-day symposium entitled Covert Messiah at Conway Hall in Holborn. This is in Britain, I believe. Although to many scholars his theory seems outlandish and is sure to upset some believers, no doubt, Atwill regards his evidence as conclusive and is confident its acceptance is only a matter of time. Says he, I present my work with some ambivalence, as I do not want to directly cause Christians any harm. Well, who knows and who cares? He acknowledges, but this is important for our culture. Alert citizens need to know the truth about our past, so we can understand how and why governments create false histories and false gods. Did we get that? How governments create false histories and false gods. This isn't like on a conspiracy website, by the way. Just thought I'd offer that. They often do it to obtain a social order that is against the best interests of the common people. I thought, am I writing this? This guy looks like he's me, you know? Atwill asserts that Christianity did not really begin as a religion, but as a sophisticated government project, a kind of propaganda exercise used to pacify the subjects of the Roman Empire, meaning especially the Jews, as a target, but not necessarily just for the Jews. And by the way, I have, this isn't like the first or only thing that I've taken a look at here. I've looked into this. Jewish sects in Palestine at the time who were waiting for the prophesied warrior Messiah, and if you're Christian, you're conditioned to think, oh, those poor darn Jews, they were looking for the wrong Jesus. They missed it when Jesus came because they weren't spiritual enough. They were looking for this warrior Messiah, but they missed him. They didn't read the prophecies correctly. But that's the way it's been marketed. However, let's take a listen and evaluate what this guy's saying, because it absolutely makes sense, and it's occurred, it's gained the type of benefit for the benefactors that was intended. The Jews were looking for a prophesied warrior Messiah. A Messiah basically is normally a war hero, leader of the Jews, okay? Just like gospel means good news of military victory. Not what you were told in church that it means, just good news of Jesus or something. Things are constantly changed. The meanings are altered. Just as we see Albert Pike saying that, the lower degrees of Freemasonry, those early, those brethren that are newer to the Masonic religion, or they're not even really practitioners of the religion, they're just they're like a tithing base. Every organization needs your people at the bottom that do a bunch of free work for you and give you money and stuff like that. And that's how religions operate. So in Freemasonry, Albert Pike's saying, they deserve to be deceived. We have various meanings for the same terms, and they don't find out what it really means till they get to the higher degrees. That's when they find out that, Lucifer is God. And where we see him, actually explaining this very articulately for the brethren of the higher degrees. But for the people on the low level, that's not for them to know. Words have different meanings. Or if we look into a song based, on things probably written maybe by Aleister Crowley himself, and then maybe adapted. At least I've heard that. I haven't actually seen the original writings of Aleister Crowley that were supposed to have contributed to the song Stairway to Heaven. But we hear the verse, saying when she gets there, she knows if the stores are all closed. With a word she can get where she came for. Well, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to get to the part where we say, because sometimes words have two meanings. So, I didn't want to go through the whole thing there. So, because sometimes words have two meanings. That's really important. That's critical to the occult religion. That's critical to the administration socially of the aspects or the brand of religion that is marketed by these people to the common man and woman for social engineering reasons. So language is engineered so that it has a different meaning for those who are in the know, the initiates, the adepts, okay? So, all right, he asserts that Christianity didn't really begin as a religion, but as a sophisticated government project. Of course, that's what religion really is. A kind of propaganda exercise used to pacify the subjects of the Roman Empire. Jewish sects in Palestine at the time, who were waiting for a prophesied warrior Messiah, were a constant source of violent insurrection during the first century. CE, right? He explains, when the Romans had exhausted conventional means of quashing rebellion, they switched to psychological warfare. They surmised that the way to stop the spread of zealous Jewish missionary activity, did he mean to say missionary activity? Missionary activity was to create a competing belief system. That's when the peaceful Messiah, aka Jesus, story was invented. Instead of inspiring warfare, this Messiah urged turn the other cheek, pacifism, and encouraged Jews to give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. As we know that one. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. These parables and these little stories are so effective in teaching concepts, and people just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. Of course, because these people are fishers of men. And pay their taxes to Rome. Pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus Christ may be the only fictional character in literature whose entire life story can be traced to other sources. Well, like the Book of Mormon's construction, as we may begin to see as we study other material on that, let's see how that correlates very similarly to the invention of the Gospels. Was Jesus based on a real person from history? The short answer is no, Atwill insists. In fact, he may be the only fictional character in literature whose entire life story can be traced to other sources, as we just read. Once those sources are all laid bare, so you can really see it, there's simply nothing left. Meaning, it's like when you pull the curtain back, when they're saying pay no attention to the little man, but when Toto the dog pulls back the curtain, there is no more concept of the great Oz. You see that it's this, little old guy talking into a microphone that's amplifying his sound, and he's got this other, illusion of the great Oz that's formerly been intimidating these people. And what we see is that things are not what they appeared to be. And that's what he's saying here. Atwill's most intriguing discovery came to him while he was studying Wars of the Jews by Josephus. That would be Flavius Josephus, and the first name is very telling because it links him to the Flavian family, supposedly by adoption. If, in fact, he's not even a pen name for another Roman citizen himself of the ruling class, who he evidently served the purpose there. Atwill's most intriguing discovery came while he was studying the Wars of the Jews by Josephus, the only surviving first-person historical account of first-century Judea alongside the New Testament. I started to notice a sequence of parallels between the two texts, he recounts. And this is basically the way I discovered a lot of things. I started to notice some similarities between things. We see that in so many things within Mormonism once our eyes have been opened, or if we have studied various things that are brought into Mormonism from other sources, and then we go, hey, I've seen that before, and then you're like, I recognize that. And there is a ton of that within Mormonism, but if you don't have the outside knowledge sourcing of these things, then of course you think, oh, that's just something God revealed to Joseph Smith. But when you're reading this, in the language of Freemasonry, when you're reading things in magic, when you're reading ancient religions and things from ancient religions and spiritualism and the things of Emanuel Swedenborg, you're going, wow, isn't that something? That's in Mormonism. You know, you see the language, you see the phrases, you see the ideas, you see the doctrines, you see rituals, and then there's a little change. Or you see in the Book of Mormon, and you see language and stories that match story after story if you're looking at the right source. Or you see something like the Nephites were, talking about the 4th of July. Are you kidding me? You know, you got a direct quote out of the late war in there and talking about the 4th of July. You know, it says in the, 7th month and the 4th day, and you're like, the 7th month and the 4th day, that's the 4th of July, and that's what they're talking about in the late war. Because it's about the war, they're talking about the War of 1812, but they talk about, some things having to do with the Declaration of Independence and all that stuff. I haven't read the whole book, but, they're referencing the early history of the United States. And you got the 4th of July in the Book of Mormon in the same words, except for they changed, the year or something. They make it the reign of the judges instead of something else, right? But, you got to be kidding me, man. Let me continue. Although it's been recognized by Christian scholars for centuries that the prophecies of Jesus appear to be fulfilled by what Josephus wrote about in the First Jewish-Roman War, I was seeing dozens more. What seems to have eluded many scholars is that the sequence of events and locations of Jesus' ministry are more or less the same as the sequence of events and locations of the military campaign of Titus Flavius, as described by Josephus. A little bit too much of a coincidence. In other words, wherever they went and had a battle or something, and in that sequence, that's where these stories happen with Jesus. It's like an allegory. It's like a veiled thing. Just like, Shakespeare or a lot of, or Mother Goose. You've got a veiled message so that those, a particular audience will be aware of it and the rest will not. Well, kind of like when, they say Jesus said in these parables, that these things are hidden from the world, but unto you, I'm showing greater knowledge, essentially. So, says he, the many of the scholars notice that the events and locations of Jesus' ministry are more or less the same as the sequence of events and locations of the military campaign of Emperor Titus Flavius, as described by Josephus. This is clear evidence and a deliberately constructed pattern. The biography of Jesus is actually constructed tip to stern, speaking in nautical terms, on prior stories, but especially on the biography of a Roman Caesar. How could this go unnoticed in the most scrutinized of books of all time? Many of the parallels are conceptual or poetic, so they aren't all immediately obvious. After all, the authors didn't want the average believer to see what they were doing, but they did want the alert reader to see it. An educated Roman in the ruling class would probably have recognized the literary game being played. Atwell maintains he can demonstrate that the Roman Caesars left us a kind of puzzle literature that was meant to be solved by future generations. And the solution to that puzzle is, we invented Jesus Christ, and we're proud of it. Is this the beginning of the end of Christianity? Probably not, he says. But what my work has done is give a permission to many of those who are ready to leave the religion to make a clean break. We've got the evidence now to show exactly where the story of Jesus came from. Although Christianity can be a comfort to some, it can also be very damaging and repressive, an insidious form of mind control that has led to blind acceptance of serfdom, poverty, and war throughout history. To this day, especially in the United States, it is used to create support for war in the Middle East. And he encourages people to challenge his assertions at the symposium they're going to have there. And, this goes, that's why I thought, who is this guy? It's like I'm writing this, where he says that this last paragraph, although Christianity, and we can replace that with Mormonism included in it, or added to it, can be a comfort to some. It can also be very damaging and repressive and insidious form of mind control, which is exercised through so many religions, that has led to blind acceptance of serfdom. Of course, it's easiest to enslave people who believe that they are free. Poverty and war throughout history. It's easiest to get people to go to war when they believe they're protecting their freedom. To this day, especially in the United States, it is used to create support for war in the Middle East. As I talked about the Amalekites on the towers, that's not something I invented, that's in the Book of Mormon. We saw that the Lamanites in the story there did not want to go to war with the Nephites in this particular instance. They said, listen, you know, those guys always kick our butts, and we're not into it. So they get the Amalekites up on the towers. You know, they get the Amalekites up at their sporting events on Military Sunday, you know, at the soccer game, at the basketball game, at the baseball game. They get they get Sean Hannity up on Fox News. They get Jerry Falwell Jr. up. They get Gordon Bittner Hinckley up. They get all their Amalekites up on the towers and say, we are like the Nephites. And those Iraqis are like the Gadianton robbers. And we are defending our liberty, our wives and our children, yea, our all. And our God has commanded us to do this. And, you know, if we go through the words of the speech that Gordon B. Hinckley made called the War on Peace speech, which I dissected in one of the videos on corporate governance and that sort of thing, secret alliances, we see Gordon using sophisticated persuasion techniques to pull a 180, you know, saying we don't like war, but personally I feel like I need to go with, you know, it's like we're like the Nephites, and those other guys are like the Gadianton robbers, even though, you know, the people that we're bombing had nothing to do with the excuse that we're using in New York. You know, if you want to bomb, you know, the palace in Saudi Arabia, maybe that's cool, but no, we're just going to attack these other people. He pulls a 180. He says, Jesus, we follow Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, the Prince of Peace. But even Jesus said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. So he pulls the 180 on us, and you're like, what the heck? We follow Jesus. He says to love one another, but I didn't really come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword, which is what you kill people with. It's like saying in modern times, I didn't come to bring peace, but, you know, an aircraft carrier with, you know, B-1 bombers and 90-inch artillery guns or whatever, you know, if you put it in modern words. And so you have these psychological manipulative strategies used on us, and Gordon is using hypnotic language as we end that, you know, saying, I don't want anybody to hate these Muslims. We love them during this time of trouble, but you have been sworn to your country's allegiance, and you who are in the military need to do what you're supposed to do, and God won't hold you responsible for, you know, blowing these people up. And anyone who's against it, you know, may actually be fighting against God, essentially. And you're like, wait a minute. What did this guy just convince us of? And so this is how these guys do exactly what this guy just said. And I, like when I dissected that talk from Gordon B. Hinckley, looking at the psychological techniques that he uses, and then ends with, we worship Jesus Christ, and uses the hypnotic language to relax us into feeling like it's all okay, everything will work out in the end. We pray for an end to these things and that we'll have a better world for everyone after we've obliterated 500,000 people. You know, if you understand how some of these techniques work, and you understand a little bit about the facts, and realize that he's switching, you know, the good guys with the bad guys here. And if you look at data and you say, okay, well, I saw something on the internet that said, you know, how many, Iran hasn't invaded another country for like 150 or 200 years or something. The United States has toppled like 33 governments since the World War II or something, they said, or, you know, at least got involved with regime building, caused a coup, whatever, invaded, done all sorts of things. So when we really look at who's doing what, it doesn't really support what we're told, you know, we're following Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. But Jesus came to bring a sword. Gordon told us, and he actually told us something true there. Jesus did come to bring a sword, and he has brought a sword. We've had from the Crusades and the Inquisitions to the invasions of all these countries to the, you know, to what goes the American, what America does in Latin America and in the Middle East and in Asia, all over the world, is just completely nuts, and we probably don't know about the 10th of it. So, funny when they mentioned Jewish missionary work there. You know, the Romans were talking about Jewish missionary work. What does missionary work do? What did missionary work proceed in Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands? What happened as soon as the Christian missionaries went in? Ooh, well, they started having, you know, political turmoil and basically a revolution, and then the United States annexed the place. What happened in the Philippines? How do we have all these territories? How often do the missionaries go in first? When I say missionaries, I'm not just saying LDS. I'm talking generally it's other Christian missionaries. But the LDS missionaries have been involved later on, you know, in Korea and Philippines and proselytizing in Japan. And what has gone on? They've taken advantage of it, and they'll probably take advantage of it, you know, someday in Iraq if they ever stop, you know, if they finish what they started 17 years ago. So I've reviewed other material on the history of the invention of Jesus, for instance. And what this guy's saying, I mean, if you look at the history, it's like, why do we have, how could Jesus just happen to show up in the same place after place, it's in the same sequence, and you're like, this is a little weird. It's a little too weird. When you lay it out, like he said, when you lay it bare, there's nothing left. I think finishing the sentences, there's nothing left to dispute. And when we look at the Book of Mormon, you know, if we study the texts that show the same things going on time after time after time, you know, if in the texts that are linked to it, that we'll probably, you know, we may find in that book, the Book of Mormon, Book of Lies, and looking at the geographical things and the, you know, the conquest of Mexico and Marco Polo stuff, all the things that this fellow has researched, because he did the same thing that I'm talking about, or his dad started noticing, and the missionary came over and they started talking about stuff that he knew things about. And he's like, no, the elephants died like, you know, whatever, 10,000 years ago or something. And he started looking into some things, and he had a lot of books. The guy was into, you know, various things. Maybe an amateur archaeologist or something, but engineering, all kinds of things. He's like, wait, what is this story you're giving me? You know what? And he's saying, as he's reading the Book of Mormon, he's like, I remember stories just like this. It's kind of like the thing, you know, Solomon Spalding people, relatives said, I remember some things that seem pretty familiar. You know, some of this sounds awfully darn familiar, but what these guys were able to map, you know, through some of the Marco Polo stuff, and maybe 20 other books, you know, histories that were all available to Joseph Smith, even though they tell us they weren't, and they've proven it. Sequentially, right through the story of some of these things, they appeared the same number of guys doing, you know, having a battle and the same kind of a city, all this, that, and the other, and it all matches the Book of Mormon. And you're like, this is too familiar. It's like when you read, like when you're reading about, you know, Royal Arch Freemasonry, and you're like, why is all this language Mormon? How did the Freemasons learn all this Mormon language? Like, wait a minute. Could it be the other way around? Where you're reading about, you know, consecrating a seer stone magically, and you're like, consecrate? Dedicate? Set apart? Whoa. How come the people in the occult know all this Mormon language? You read about dedicating Masonic temples, and you're like, dedicate temple? And the Order of Melchizedek and high councils and all this stuff within Freemasonry, you're like, why did they copy Mormonism? They didn't. The Tree of Life vision, you know, Joseph Smith, what his dad or grandpa had, you know, that happens to be in the Book of Mormon just the same way. But when Lucy Mack, you know, basically writes a confession, and you're seeing, oh, that was actually published in 1811, the same vision. except for, it's like a prickly pear, like a chestnut or whatever, which is exactly what Lucy Mack says that, the Smith family member saw it as, exactly the way it's published in 1811, someone else's story. Like she's trying to say, I'm really sorry for all the crap that's happened here because, this hoax we pulled. But we can recognize these patterns, and things have been very cleverly orchestrated in literature to create historical figures that are not historical. Like when I first saw that film, The Zeitgeist, and I saw this part and realized all these historians living near Jerusalem, but none of them ever heard of Jesus Christ. All this Zoroastrianism into Judaism that came into Christianity, all this symbolic stuff, all these pagan rituals that we've got, geared with the harvest and the solstice and the spring equinox, and they're all Christian holidays. Everything in our culture, so many things in our culture and in our religion came from ancient times, and some of it long before Adam would have lived according to the Christian dogma. And came from other sources, but has been adapted with a new narrative, with a new name, with a new word, with a new meaning, like Albert Pike was telling us in Morals and Dogma. That the people on the bottom of the pyramid scheme that our society is won't understand what is written, but the people in the know, the adepts, the initiates that run society, including the largest of corporations, including religious 501c3 corporations called churches, understand. Because it is hidden. And it's hidden often in plain sight, like an obelisk. Phallus worship, sun god worship, that we find in Vatican Square, that we find in Washington, D.C., that we find in London, that we find in Mormonism, that we find when we look at the gravestones or the memorials of these people, like Joseph Smith. What will you find memorializing him? An obelisk. Will you find that in Palmyra? Will you find that at their family home? Why are there obelisks? All these places where Joseph Smith is being memorialized. Why are there obelisks and pyramids where people like Charles Taze Russell or Ellen Gould White, we're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists, leaders, all these occultists and their gravestones, their memorials, we'll find these things. Have you ever been into a graveyard where certain people are, memorialized? You ever look at all the Freemasonic stuff? You ever look at who's memorialized where and what sort of things we have? Have you been in a Masonic temple? You've been in Washington, D.C.? Well, thanks to the internet, you can explore a lot of places without actually having to have a seer stone or a crystal ball. You've got your own liquid crystal display. You've got your own digital seer stone available. When I use the Google application, it's incredible. I just ask questions, and it's like watching Star Trek 30 years ago. Computer, tell me the contributions of Zoroastrianism to Judaism, Computer or Google, just change the name. And you're like, whoa, what is the, computer, tell me the name. You don't have to look it up in the dictionary. What does Daniel mean? What does Israel mean? What does Michael mean? And you see the L, having to do with the God that preceded Yahweh, El, his father. Well, all these names mean the same thing. Several of them do. I did use 3 of them. They all meant basically the same thing: gift of God. If you look at all these, there's so many things hidden within our language that show us that the roots of Christianity and the roots of Mormonism are not at all what we've been told. Just like we were told that Joseph Smith got this. Well, first they told us he got it, the Book of Mormon. He had a magic. Whoa. Okay, so what was the deal? Maybe I've got other versions of this that are, I mean, I didn't want to make this too long. So what do we have? We got a young magician, or he's attempting to be a magician, with a seer stone. It comes up with the story of having gold plates that he finds that, maybe in connection, he sees them with his seer stone. Later we get a new version that it's, a messenger, a spiritual messenger named Nephi. And, after Joseph Smith's dead, that changes to, an angel called Moroni. But we get this evolving, rewritten history. And then they, and Joseph Smith, a few years before he died, starts, he published, 2 years before he died, publishes this new thing with this first vision business that no one ever heard of. So he's this magician, trying to be a magician. He comes up with these golden plates that no one ever sees, written in Reformed Egyptian, he says, that tell us the origin of the American Indians that everybody wanted to know about. They were, a lost tribe of Israel. They talk about Freemasonry. I mean, his hookup's husband was murdered the same year he was translating the Book of Mormon, or creating the Book of Mormon in 1829, William Morgan, whose widow Joe hooked up with, even though she was married. And they became members of the church, and, well, we're not going to get into that story. Guy comes up with he was the answer man. And then he's got this storyline from these various books that include all sorts of interesting geographical and military things, and make the Book of Mormon look very complicated and difficult because he didn't have to invent that. Smart people don't reinvent the wheel. They just copy it and maybe improve upon it a little bit. And if we look at guys like Joseph Smith, look at Tony Robbins, Anthony Robbins. If that's like saying Joseph Smith, make him sound better. Tony Robbins, did he ever have an original thing ever that he taught? Who knows? But he did an excellent job of borrowing and putting together and learning and sharing technologies that helped people to achieve more. And Joseph Smith, we look at he's maybe the greatest copycat of all time. We find Swedenborg, we find the arguments of Christianity into these stories that are woven into these other things that he already was able to glean from somewhere else. We see mistakes in there. He screwed up a lot of things. He left the fingerprints of fraud, which I've done other videos on, so I'm not going to talk about that. But, when we see the Christian arguments in the Book of Mormon, long before Christianity existed, and we see the anachronism of the use of the name Jesus Christ, that's a big thing. He's a testimony of Jesus Christ. That's why it's so great. It's the third gospel. Okay, I'm talking about Mark Dice. Mocking, it's a new gospel. You guys are hilarious, but what's ridiculous is that, of course, it's completely anachronistic. Talking, using Greek words and talking about New Testament things in Old Testament times is ridiculous. Using French in Old Testament times is ridiculous. Quoting New Testament characters in Old Testament timeline is ridiculous. Technologies, from the Spanish invasion, with their steel swords or whatever they had, their metal swords and their armor against the Lamanites, the Aztecs, but oops, the artifacts don't match up. The Nephi, we don't find ancient warfare stuff that the narrative discusses, which in fact occurred, but with the conquistadors. So those things that are out of place, those are the issues that people have with the Book of Mormon. They go, wait a minute, you didn't have wheels, and you didn't have elephants, and you didn't have steel swords and armor and things that the conquistadors had against the Lamanites, is what we were then calling them, in the Book of Mormon, the Aztecs and the Incas. And we have storyline narratives from various, from stuff even in Asia in the Book of Mormon that match absolutely with all sorts of things that are just incredible, found in the book that I was mentioning by Kendall Sheets. And it does an excellent job of weaving things together with a narrative that would be difficult to come up with for anyone. Well, of course, he's getting it from automatic writing, revelation from some spiritual source, which some people do. I mean, L. Ron Hubbard supposedly did that, and actually I've had experience with that kind of thing myself. So it's not like you can't get revelation from spiritual sources, but deciding to put it into a belief system where you're able to tax people 10% of their income or whatever it is, everything they've got, if you come up with the law of consecration, you know, the order of Enoch, as they called it. But other people were doing that at the same time. Other people were practicing the spiritual wife system. Other people were talking about Indians being, you know, Hebraic. Other people were concerned about Freemasonry, you know, secret combinations. None of this stuff, you know, other people, you know, the Temperance Society was talking about most everything that's in the Word of Wisdom. You know, got the distillery in Kirtland shut down 3 weeks before Joseph Smith comes up with the Word of Wisdom. None of this stuff is original. You just have to notice it. But we get taught in priesthood manuals, oh, Joseph Smith was way ahead of his time, and just you know, because God revealed to him the Word of Wisdom. God revealed this. God revealed that. They don't talk about God said that we're going to have a temple reared in this generation in Missouri. God said, go to Toronto and sell the copyright for the Book of Mormon. You'll be successful for sure. We'll get the money we need. Instead of God just giving them, you know, a couple gold bars and make it easy. You know, failed prophecy after failed revelation after failed bank, illegal bank after busted for being in the barn, getting the maid pregnant. You know, one thing after another, but we don't find these things in the correlated lessons. So we've been conditioned to believe from our youth or our childhood in some cases, things, and heard so many times, oh, you know, this guy, he's wonderful, he's holy, about Joseph Smith or Jesus Christ. You can't find Jesus in history. You can only find him in the storybook that the, you know, Romans published. You know, it's like you find Yahweh in the Jewish book. It's one book together, so we pretend it's like a thing, but it's not. It's a compilation. And Joseph Smith, yeah, he existed, but everything he brought us was gleaned from somewhere else, and maybe he adjusted it a little bit. You know, he adjusted the signs and tokens and keywords in the temple. He adjusted or mingled Luciferian Masonic doctrines with Swedenborgian doctrines. You think it's revelation, but if you read the sources, you're like, this sure looks familiar. Anyway, so I'll do some other stuff, and I have done a number of things, but some of this stuff is material I haven't really been covering, so wanted to weave in some additional perspective. I don't think that our Christian listeners are going to be thrilled with this. I'm a minion of Satan, no doubt. But if you look, just read the material. Check out the, you know, Jewish wars. See what this, you know, you can find this stuff. Look up like the Piso and Flavian families. You know, just because something's on YouTube doesn't make it evil. Just because something's on the internet. Remember, les.org is on the internet. Of course, it's evil. They lie through their teeth, and I've shown that. But it's a medium of information. I could get some things wrong. Brigham Young could have taught some things that are right. Adolf Hitler could have taught things that are right. Things that we've been so conditioned to reject things based on saying someone's not credible. They don't have a doctorate. They don't have a master's degree. They are a lesbian. They messed up on a couple of things, therefore everything they wrote was wrong, or we created a false paradigm, you know, and made them look bad, so don't trust anything they say. We're calling them an apostate, which means they're evil because they don't support Joseph Smith, so they're evil. But when we look at the details ourselves, rather than just be persuaded by fancy-talking guys from Fox News or Fair Mormon or CNN, or the President of the United States, when I think of fancy talking, and when I think of George Bush and the marvelous talk he seemed to have prepared for his whole life for with the 9/11 speech, and then when he didn't have, like, I don't know, a teleprompter or something, and they said, President Bush, what was the deal? What can you tell us about this whole thing at 9/11? And he wasn't prepared, and he said, well, it was wrong, and it was illegal. And I thought, that's the best that dude could come up with. The President of the United States just told us that 9/11 was wrong and it was illegal. Because he didn't have a speech prepared, written by somebody. So, why did I have to throw that in? Don't worry, I hate Hillary too. Um, they all work for the same people. And the more we learn about how things really operate and what organizations and what is behind these NGOs and secretive and secret societies, we find an occult mystery religion in common. And a lot of it can be detected through spotting people involved in various organizations, whether they're with Freemasonry or, MSOM, Military Sovereign Order of Malta, in other words, Knights of Malta, or a sister organization, or the Golden Dawn, or there are so many of these organizations, but the people at the high level have esoteric knowledge. And when you've got those people heading Christian religions, it should throw some red flags, because the theologies are somewhat different. And I'm not saying that the Christian theology is better, but I'm saying that the people are not preaching what they believe, because it is created, as this man said, as a means of social control, and it's a means of parasitic taxation of the people, through not only through what they believe is government publicly owned, which is actually privately owned corporately in their cities, states, counties, and pension funds, which can be proven through the comprehensive annual financial reports. But in their churches, they're privately owned corporate churches. In the name of the age of reason, like, subscribe, share, and share interesting links that help, us evaluate other evidence of what's really going on. Have a great day. Dodger game out.